Being in denial is really not going to change that reality that's out there. You know, reality is what keeps going on when you stop believing in it. It's what's happening, whether you believe it or you don't believe it. If the train is coming on and you say, I don't believe it, it's still going to hit you.
This is Peak Moment. We are living at a peak of human innovation, information, wealth, and health. But we're also at a peak of population and consumption, with rising temperatures and declining resources fueled by cheap oil and gas. Peak Moment Television, bringing you examples of positive responses to energy decline and climate change through local community action.
That gets to something that I want to talk about. If you knew you were going to lose your job in 6 months, right, or worse, you knew that you were terminal illness and you had 6 months to a year to live, right, that model of the decisions you would make for a personal change like that, people have been using for peak oil, the model that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross brought for how we face that kind of devastating information, the grief and the bargaining and the anger and so on. And I remember you saying that model doesn't quite fit here.
No, I don't embrace it. I don't embrace it because we're not dying, you know? I mean, the thing about dying, yeah, but I don't also, I mean, there was a belief in psychology that patients got attached to the institutions, not the therapist. And I think it's the same sort of thing. I don't think you can take a way of life or a culture and then say we're grieving for it in the same way that we grieve for each other or our relationships with each other or any of that stuff. Here's my thought. My thought is that there are ways to frame what we're going through that aren't attached to death or dying. They are focused on living. They focus on adaptation and resilience. Okay. And I'm not big into pathological models and also the other you know, sort of pragmatic issue is that her model, while it's been widely embraced, has also been discredited because there are now much more recent theories that say that people don't have to go through any of those stages, that there are some people who can effectively look at crises or trauma or whatever and just simply kind of say, well, all right, things happen, and kind of get on and do their thing. And the models would say that they're in denial for how they really feel. All right. But what the research is saying is, no, they're not in denial of anything. Now, I can make interesting discussion about those kinds of people and how other people respond to them, because they often tend to be folks that are not well liked by other people because they just have a very pragmatic, let's just get on with it, let's just live our life.
Are you saying there really isn't a model for how people will respond to the changes in their lives that are coming because of the economic collapse and things that are already happening? It's about just being present with whatever you do feel? I mean,
well, I don't think there's stages. I guess that's what I'm saying. I think that there are emotions that are common, and I think people go through those emotions, and sometimes they move through them, and then sometimes they go back to them, and they have their various coping mechanisms. And if you tend to be obsessive compulsive, you're going to be more so. If you tend to be depressive, you're going to be more so. If you tend to be an extrovert, you're going to reach out. If you tend to be an introvert, you're going to draw back. So it may exaggerate the personality style that we already have, but I don't like the neatness of either styles or stages of grief, and I also don't like the notion of post-petroleum stress disorder at all.
What is, I haven't heard about this. What is
well, it? It's in the transition handbook, and one of the things that they say is that because we have these emotional reactions to learning about it, we are going through emotional reactions in response to that they call post-petroleum stress disorder, like post-traumatic stress disorder, and they line up how these are similar in various ways. Again, I don't like to pathologize people in that way. I don't think it's helpful to put a label on it. I know what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is say people have real emotions around this. And they are real, they're legitimate emotions. And in this culture, right, the only way you kind of get attention for legitimate emotions is to try to put a diagnostic label on it and say they're valid. But it's knowing what I know about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, it's not a very useful way of approaching people and their emotions. So I try to discount or disregard or really not focus on any of that. Instead, sticking to, these are what my contributors are telling me are the emotional reactions. And then talking about those and, you know, trying to get them to say, and then what happened to you? And then tell their story. And then what happened? And then how did it change your life? How did you start to do things differently? And what I think has been amazing is that some of the people who we label the most doom and gloom are what I call do more doomers.
Do more doomers?
Yeah. Oh. They do more. In other words, they hear all the stuff, what's going on, and it motivates them to action.
That's true, yeah, okay.
Because one of the biggest things you hear is that if I let myself go into a doomy place, I'll just crawl up in a ball and cry my life away, you know. And I say to them, well, you know, if you were standing on a railroad track and a train was coming, would you just say, oh, I'll probably be killed if I just sit here, oh my goodness, let me cry. No, you would look at it, and if you believed it was really coming, you get off tracks.
Sure.
And if there were other people who were standing on the tracks, you would try to tell them to get off or try to pull them off. But if they were insisting on getting back on right before the train came, you have a choice. You're going to jump in there with them, or you're just going to say, whoa, you know. As some people very rudely say, it's thinning the herd. You know, they don't have the sense to get out of the way, then they're going to be impacted by it. So people on my lecture tour will say, but we need them, don't we? And I say, well, you know, of course we need as many people as we possibly can get, but you don't reach people who are in denial by trying to hit them harder with the facts. All you do is reinforce the denial that they're having, and now they're even more pushing away, you know.
I should back up for a second here and say, you've been mentioning your contributors a bunch, and we should let our folks know that who you are, Kathy McMahon, Dr. Kathy McMahon, clinical psychologist.
Yep.
You call yourself the Peak Shrink. And your blog is what, Peak Oil Blues?
PeakOilBlues.com.
Yep. So the contributors are people that are replying to you on your blog.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Which you've had going for a few years, so you've had a time to really hear people over a while here.
Yeah, I've been collecting letters for 4.5 years. Yeah. And what I've done in a couple of years is to actually reach out and say, okay, you wrote me a couple of years ago, what is happening now with you? And some of the stories are really remarkable. I mean, some of the changes that people have made are really dramatic changes that have happened over, you know, 1 or 2 year time. They really are living differently. They are really thinking about their world differently.
It seems to me that news as devastating as when you really get the impact that peak oil can have in changing the whole, and I would add, and climate change and overshoot. I mean, that was one of the first ones for me, realizing that the population on the planet, even if we did everything the U.S. ought to be doing for climate change and everything everybody ought to be, you know, doing on getting an alternate energy, it's like the population just, that alone looks to me like it may well sink a big part of the ship or shift everything. And that was one I couldn't face early on. It took me a while to sort of tiptoe into that one, and I realized, because at that point you realize that even if we enacted everything, just the human push to have more, until those resource limits hit us, that's where limits are not probably going to come because of all that we end up doing. And that's hard news. That's hard to take. So part of what I think that I have found, and I found it with others, is that we go through phases, you know, of allowing in the hard information and then finding a way to how do I be with that and keep going? Because you're right, it isn't a terminal sentence for me personally, because I realized that if I'd got a terminal illness diagnosis and I have a year to live, there's a whole lot of stuff I would drop off my life because I wouldn't need to be responsible for it in a year. That's
Yeah.
not true here.
Right.
You know, part of it is how do we stay here, be responsible or be responsive,
Yeah.
and go along with an awareness that everything isn't changing so much in the, it will be changing in the future, but it's changing even right now.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that I've been saying on my tour is that the United States is in a Great Depression. And we don't, during the last Great Depression, nobody on the news said, hey folks, we're in a major depression right now. You know, they said prosperity is right around the corner, everything is fine, you know, we have to be optimistic, and all of those same messages are coming around again. Those same sort of, you know, I make a joke and say the green shoots aren't there anymore because we pulled them up and ate them. You know, but it's true. I mean, when you add 12% on to the unemployment figures, which is how you have to look at it in order to make it the same as during the last Great Depression, using government figures, this area is, you know, close to 21% unemployment here in Washington State, and California is almost 24%.
Which is right up there with the last depression.
25 was at the peak of the last depression.
Well, that's part of that happy face, right? Because if the government comes out and says, well, we really are in a depression, then the whole level of confidence drops even further down, right?
Yeah.
And we have more, whatever. People hoard more, I suppose. They aren't going to be good consumers, which is what they're relying on this time.
Yeah.
And
in other words, they want to keep the game going.
Yes,
Imagine
yes,
for a moment,
yes.
and this is what I start to believe about myself and about other people. We're gamblers. And we're gambling, like playing on the lucky sevens, hoping that we'll be able to go on and keep this life just a little longer.
Yeah.
We don't want to have to change prematurely, you know? And it's like a gambling casino coming out and saying to everybody who goes in, by the way, when you go in there, you're not going to win any money. We're going to take a lot of money from you. You're going to really probably be depressed and really sad probably in 6 months from now. But we just wanted to let you know you know, nobody's going to do that. Do you know what I'm saying? But when you look at it and when you say we can't tell people what's really going on, because then they'll start to take the actions that they really need to take in order to keep themselves safe.
Yes, yes.
What are we saying? And who are elected officials if they're actually telling us, keep getting into debt, you know, keep believing that your job is secure, even though we know that it's not, keep, you know, in denial, basically.
Because, well, we've already pointed out beginning here is that if a politician really said all of those things. I was on Mike Rupert's radio show, and he asked me, if you were president of the United States, what would you say to the people? And I was like, my mind, what could he really say? And I realized that if the president came out and said, we're in a depression, and your consumer spending, which was 70% of our economy, isn't going to fix it.
Right.
And we're getting, you know, huge, and we aren't going to be able to do fiscal stimulus and unemployment forever, or even maybe Medicare and Social Security forever. And he'd have to lay out a plan. I want every community to be doing, you know, something. People would expect something, you know, start the victory gardens.
Yeah, yeah.
And that could only happen if it was a lame duck president who knew he wasn't going to get reelected and could tell the truth.
Well, we already have a Cassandra, right? Cassandra was the figure in Greek mythology that was given the ability to predict the future accurately, but then she ticked off Apollo, and Apollo cursed her so that she'd never be believed. Well, we have a Cassandra in our midst, and that was Jimmy Carter 33 years ago. And he basically told us, you know, that we were a wasteful nation and that we needed to go on a strict program of conservation. And he laid it out. You know, he was a leader. Now, the way he did it may not have been very influential. If you watch it, he does this as he's talking. You know, it's not exactly charismatic. But he did that. And I think what happened is we got a cowboy who told us, don't worry, you know, we'll just be able to make it, everything's fine.
New morning in America.
Yeah. And take the stupid solar panels off the White House and everything will be fine. And I think we bought that because part of us really wants to believe it.
Yeah.
And, you know, and then people will say, well, but that was 30 years ago and we haven't hit the crash yet, which, you know, I think is really fascinating too, because it's like an electrician coming to your house and saying your wiring is so bad the house is going to burn down, and you saying, oh, I don't believe that. You know, not even getting a second opinion, just saying, I don't believe that. And then 6 months goes by and the house isn't burned down. You say, see, he was wrong. We don't have to worry about it. Well, you know, it could burn down the 7th month or the 8th month. Yeah. And being in denial is really not going to change that reality that's out there. You know, reality is what keeps going on when you stop believing in it. It's what's happening, whether you believe it or you don't believe it. If the train is coming on and you say, I don't believe it, it's still going to hit you.
Yeah, that's that cognitive thing you were talking about earlier. It's like, we just believe so solidly that the American myth of progress is going to continue into forever.
Yeah. And we're afraid of the wrong things, Jeanette. And that was one of the things that really struck me when I was doing this whole conversation about Panglossian disorders, you know, is that we really have the part that says I'm unrealistically happy about what's happening, but we also have another part which says I'm unrealistically gloomy and doomy about what's happening. And, you know, we will talk in the popular media about the survivalists, and the survivalists are having their guns and they're in the hills with their beans. I don't know any survivalists like that, and I do know survivalists. You have a conversation with them and they talk about community, they talk about responsibility to other people, they talk about you know, putting away extra food to be able to help your neighbors and people that need it. I think what we're not talking about are what I call the yuppie survivalists. And we see a lot more of them, but we accept them as legitimate. And those are the people who say, I'm going to put a solar panel on my house, I'm going to buy a Prius, I'm going to live in a wealthy community that behind a gate, and I'm going to be safe because of that. And I think that that's hysterical, because here you have these gated communities, right? And they're thinking that they hire a rent-a-cop at minimum wage with a pop gun in his back pocket, and when these hordes come, that he's going to protect the people behind the gate from them. But I say you might as well put a sign on the gate saying, raiding and hoarding starts here, you know, pilfering begins at this spot, because you're basically saying that.
You're going to get better results there than if you go, you know, down into the urban blight area. It's like, yeah,
I mean,
wealth is here.
Where would you go if you were looking for money and food and resources? You'd go where it was, you know? So I think that we are focusing on the wrong things. We're afraid of the wrong things. You know, we have the movies like The Road that have this image of such a horrendous life, and we all think, well, if we don't have that, then nothing is really wrong. And we don't look at the real areas of concern, the real fears that we need to be frightened about, like chronic wars that will never go away, you know, or fears of unemployment with people who have been previously middle class, and they don't even think to themselves when they're down to their last dollar, when they're 3 months behind on their mortgage payments and they can't take any more cash advances from their credit cards because they max them out. They don't think of themselves as poor. So they don't think of themselves as entitled to any social programs like welfare. And they also are filled with shame as a result, and they don't talk. A real life example, I'm sitting across from a woman, and I have a woman to my right, and we're talking about the Great Depression. And I tell the woman who's there about my own business collapse and how it was for me to go from being a middle class person to barely being able to scrape a hold of my house, and not month to month not knowing if I would be able to stay there. And the woman next to me was a friend of hers for quite a while, and she said, yeah, I lost 2/3 of my income over the last 2 years. And the woman across was like, what? It was brand new news. She said, yeah, I went on food stamps, and yeah, I had to sell my house, and she'd never told her friend directly like that, and her friend had no idea. And maybe that friend would have interacted in a different way with her had she known the economic troubles that she was having. But these are the fears These are the real legitimate doomsday scenarios that are actually happening that we can't look into because we keep waiting for the road.
Well, or we keep waiting for it to turn around. And I think you've named, by naming this shame, I think that takes some, because it's back to thinking, well, there's something wrong with me that I've tried for 18 months and I still haven't found a job. And, I hear that from friends who aren't going to reach out and think of this as sort of an odd new situation rather than this may be the new normal. And it may deepen at points, and it may take more of us. And so
and you begin to reframe what you do from month to month if you think that way, as opposed to, I'll get a job next month. In other words, if you really grasp the idea that this is not going to suddenly turn around in 6 months or a year, you begin to look at your life very differently. You begin to cut things out permanently in a very different way than you would if you said, well, I hate to take the cable television away from the kids because they love the Disney Channel. If you realize, look, you're getting down to whether you could keep a house, or you're getting down to whether you should sell the house now because then you'll have a little bit of extra money. If you wait a year, you won't get anything out of your house. That's a very different perspective, And that's where the idea of accepting bad news becomes really important, because that's going to change the way that you live from day to day. That's not even touching on how do we begin to prepare for massive immigration from the Southwest when we run out of water. And they begin to move into these states because you can't live without water. Well, if you're a city planner, and your job is to think ahead and say, how do we need to build in resources to cope with population change? What I'm hearing is the people who are in the know around that recognize that these city planners are not taking that into account. They're not looking at their population tripling or quadrupling or going into, unbelievably hard to fathom numbers. And so I sit with some of these young men in a public space, and they're crying to me. They are literally crying to me and saying how isolated they feel in their job, how isolated they feel in their community, because they know, on the one hand, that this is truly going to happen, and that if we think ahead, maybe we'll begin to mitigate some of the impact on it, and yet they're not listened to in their work situation, and they're not listened to in their social situation, and they've got small children, and they're grieving for what those children are going to be looking at.
I get goosebumps when you say that, because these are people who really have done the rigorous study. I mean, they're not going to just jump at some pie in the sky belief. If they've done the rigorous study of stuff and see this, and enough to feel it.
Absolutely.
I mean, those are the people we should be hearing.
Absolutely. And the thing that is what I do, part of my mission, if you will, right, is to be able to say to people like that, look, you are a handsome young man, right? And I know how difficult it is to stand away from your culture and to provide bad news to people, but you have a lot of skills in being able to articulate what's going on. You have a handsome persona. You are, you have that ability. And how are you going to feel, right, when you look back and you say, I didn't want to say it because I didn't want to be considered a weirdo? How are you going to feel when you could have, but you chose not to because you didn't want people to think badly of you? It's a terrific bind, and I think, again, my job is to be able to say to them, yeah, it's a terrific bind, and yet you're stuck with it. You're a leader, You may not want to be, you may not consider yourself, but we're counting on you in your community. We're counting on you.
What important gift you're bringing to people, in a sense, to both empower. I mean, I hear that you know, empower him just to take that next step, because he's got that information and he's got the feeling, and you're saying you've got what it takes to do that, and you're not weird, or if you are, you're weird compared to the Matrix, but you know, you're part of the, you know, the team that's down below in the, you know.
As a lot of my contributors say, I wish I was crazy because then I could take a pill and it would all go away. But there's no pill.
Yeah, there isn't. We've already taken the
and again, I think it's enormously empowering for people to have a clinical psychologist to say to them, yeah, that's pretty typical. Yeah, that's what I'm hearing.
We're not. Yeah, I find myself saying to folks that are, every now and then when I get a chance to chat, you're not alone.
No.
You're not the only one that's feeling this. You're not the only one that's getting this information and getting it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I want to say that people, the woman asked me today, she said, do you have moments where you're hopeful, you know? Because again, whenever you talk about anything that's negative, they immediately want to go jump to the hope card, you know? And I said, well, you know, look at my situation, you know, in 4 hours, I had a lecture tour set up in 12 places. That was 3,000 miles away from my home, and I've had people open up their homes. I've had people set up lecture spots for me and cameras and really give out of their home, feed me, you know, take me around, introduce me to friends, introduce me to the local media and stuff. I said, that is an enormous reason to feel hopeful.
Yeah.
Because there really is this sort of almost missionary feeling that we're trying to save the world. And it sounds really grandiose to say that. But it's happening, like you said, you know. We don't have to say when it happens, and I'm correcting people more and more because they say when this, and I wait, no, it is.
It is, yes.
It's happening right now.
That's right.
You know,
that's
right now.
If you're willing to look at those headlines, you're watching collapse happening now, and people responding to collapse and doing mitigation and doing some preparations and telling others. You're right. I'm going to let folks know again that I'm here with Kathy McMahon, who's the Peak Shrink. We're in Seattle on a rainy day, which is very Seattle-ish. I'm Janaea Donaldson. This is Peak Moment. Locally reliant living for challenging times. Yeah, we're talking about sort of personal resilience, aren't we?
Yeah.
Really, is really what you're saying for these challenges that are here now, not future, here.
Believing yourself, believing what you're saying, and actually doing the kinds of steps that make sense if you did take yourself seriously.